Welcome to the Code with Jason Meetup, Europe edition. Today we're going to do some live coding similar to what we did in the last couple sessions. For anybody who hasn't seen the last couple sessions, or for you two, Liping and Ori, who are here at this meetup right now, what I did in the last couple of sessions was I added some tests to some code that didn't have any tests. And today I'm going to be continuing with that process. So I'll kind of explain what this program does. I'll explain a little bit about what I've done so far. And then I'll explain what I'd like to do today, and we'll dive into it. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so first I'll explain what this program is that I wrote. So I have a snail mail newsletter that I send out every month. Right now, there are about 200 recipients. The way that I get my recipients' addresses is that I have a WordPress site where there's a form and people enter their addresses into the form. And then the manual way is that I just log into WordPress and then I download a CSV, and then I upload my CSV to the website of the label manufacturer, and then I get a PDF from there, and then I print the PDF onto my label paper. And that's fine, but it's a bit manual and a little bit tedious, repetitive, that kind of thing. And so I thought maybe I can write a program so that instead of doing all that manual work, I can just download that CSV automatically and have it go straight to a PDF. So that's what I did. I wrote a program that will hit the WordPress API and download my list of addresses. And then from that, it will generate a PDF. But the problem was it didn't have any tests, and so I added some tests. So let's start by looking at the tests that I wrote. Okay, and these tests might still have some room for improvement, but here's what I have so far. So this is kind of funny. I have this hashtag here for no reason. Okay, so describe consuming recipients. And it's been a little bit since I looked at this test, so I'm kind of seeing it for the first time myself in a way. Response body equals, so I have a list that happens to contain just one item here, my own address. And then I'm stubbing this request. And then I'm asserting that the list that I get includes the recipient. And actually, I find this test a little bit hard to understand because it's a little bit noisy. Like when I see this chunk here, that's kind of noisy. And one thing I talk about with tests and with application code as well is highlighting what's essential and hiding what's incidental. And so to me, this test here certainly seems essential. And the response body seems fairly essential too. But the details of how this stubbing happens seems pretty incidental. And it seems inappropriate to give this stubbing equal weight with these other things, given the fact that the stubbing is so much less important than these other two things. So I'm going to move this to somewhere else. I'm going to create a new method. I don't know what I'm going to call it exactly. For a second, I'll call it stub address request. And then I'll call it here. Okay. And then I will run this test. Okay, I made a mistake. Okay, I'm calling response body, even though that's a local variable and I don't have access to that. So I guess I'll pass response body. Okay, and then I'll run my test again. Okay, so that works. Whoops. Okay, so let me see what I think of this now. Um, so obviously this code is still present in the same file, but I've moved it down a little bit so that it doesn't come first. So now the first thing that I naturally see is this stuff, and then I see this after. So I'm saying describe consuming recipients. This description I think could use some work also. Yeah, let's actually address that now. Okay. And by the way, if you're watching and you're like, I don't know what Jason's doing, I don't know what this test is about. Um, for one, part of what I'm doing right now is trying to make this test easier to understand so that you can understand what this test is about. Um, and yeah, that's my hope is that when you look at this, it's blatantly obvious what this test is. So right now I'm just trying to take this imperfect test and make it a bit easier to understand. Um, okay, so what's really happening here? I'm hitting the WordPress API. I'm asserting that when I hit the WordPress API, I get the addresses in a certain format. Okay. So I'm going to say consuming recipients from WordPress API. Let's say it formats the response into a hash. Okay. And instead of just response body, I'm going to call this WordPress response body. And maybe that makes it a little bit easier to understand. So I'm going to run my test because I changed some stuff. Okay, it still works. Good. Okay, describe consuming recipients from the WordPress API. And I'm saying WordPress response body equals that stuff. And I'm saying stub address request, giving it the WordPress response body. Then I'm saying it formats the response into a hash. And what is it? That's a little bit unclear. So maybe we'll have to address that, but we might have to make some deeper changes in order to be able to change that. Okay, so I'm going to commit my changes that I just made. And I'll say what I always say is that before I make a commit, I do a git status to make sure that the files I think I'm changing match the files that I'm actually changing. And then I always do a git diff before I commit, just to make sure I'm not committing anything I'm not intending to commit. That catches mistakes a lot of the time, actually. Okay, so everything looks good to me. So I'm going to commit. Make recipient list test easier to understand. Okay. So let's now maybe make it even easier to understand. Okay, so this is called recipient list spec. Let's look at recipient list.rb. Okay, this is not in the form of a class. I'm a big fan of object-oriented programming. I usually express my code in terms of classes. So maybe let's try to do that, because when we look at this test, and if you want to understand a program, it's nice if you can look at the test and gain an understanding from the tests. But this test right now is less understandable than it could be. So again, it formats the response into a hash. What is it? Let's make it so it is a class called recipient list. Okay. So where's this even interacting with the application code? I guess it's when right here when we call the recipients method. So let's maybe do this. Let's have a class called recipient list. Oops. Class recipient list, how about? Okay. And then we can rename this method recipients, or maybe we can just keep it what it is. We'll keep it for now. Even though I don't like recipient list.recipients, that feels a little bit awkward, but whatever. Okay. Say recipient list equals recipient list dot new, and we can say recipient list. Let's actually call it items. Okay, so I'm going to go over here and change recipients to items. Okay, expect recipient list.items.first to include the specific name and address. Now, I don't really expect this to work. Let's see. Oh, it worked. Okay. I usually don't go that long without making a mistake. Okay. And in one of these recent videos, I talked about the 4 phases of a test. You have your setup, exercise, assertion, and teardown. And I like to keep those things separate because if you keep those phases separate, it makes the test easier to understand. So this part where we initialize a recipient list, I think that that is part of the setup. So I'm going to move it, but this is like the assertion. So I'm going to move this recipient list initialization from the assertion phase to the setup phase. Yeah, let's see if that still works. Okay. Okay, and here's something else I can do. I can say describe recipient list to see if that still works. Okay. So now that I have that, it becomes clear that the thing I'm working with is recipient list. And to answer my question before, it formats the response into a hash. What formats the response into a hash? Recipient list does. And I don't know that this structure that I have right now is the best. I think it's probably not. But we can continue to improve this incrementally. Because I don't know, it feels a bit inappropriate. The recipient list is formatting the response into a hash. That feels like a bit of a mismatch. Recipient list feels like a high level of abstraction. Formatting the response into a hash feels like a very low level job that's inappropriate for the level of abstraction of recipient list. And the reason that I think it's not good to mix levels of abstraction like that or have a mismatch between the levels of abstraction is because the more different the levels of abstraction, the harder things are to understand. It's more easy to understand a piece of code when everything in it is at the same level of abstraction. Anyway, I forget if I even ran this, so I'm going to run it again. Okay, good. Now I'm going to commit this. As always, git status, git diff. So I changed response list into a class. That's mainly what I did. Sorry, recipient list. Recipient list into a class. And by the way, Li Ping, Ori, if either of you guys have any questions or comments at any time, feel free to just interrupt. Okay. So our test is looking a little bit better, and I think recipient list is looking a little bit better. But as I said, this job of formatting the response into a hash feels inappropriate for recipient list, which is at such a higher level of abstraction. So maybe we have an object that represents the WordPress response. Let's see. Okay, so to orient ourselves here, again, we're setting this WordPress response body. We're stubbing the address request, and who cares how that works? And by the way, maybe I should explain this. Why are we stubbing this address request? The reason is because this program hits the WordPress API of my website. Codewithjason.com runs on WordPress. I don't want to hit the real API in my test because there's a number of reasons why that is. But a couple of the reasons are it can make the test non-deterministic. A test is deterministic if it works the same way every time. But if I actually hit codewithjason.com, what if, for example, codewithjason.com goes down? Then my test will fail, even though my program still works right. And so that's not appropriate for my test to fail, even though my program still works right. And also, this test only reads, it doesn't write. But obviously, you wouldn't want to be writing to a real production API. So it's a good practice to stub those requests, meaning instead of hitting this actual URL, we have a library that catches that outgoing request and gives a fake response. So the fake response is this. Although it mimics the real response, it's the same format. You can see in the body of the stubbing request, we take this WordPress response body and convert it to JSON. But again, we don't want to have to care about these details of how the stubbing happens. We just want to know that the stubbing happens. And as I'm looking at this, it seems more appropriate to do this. Okay. And you might wonder why I felt like that was more appropriate. The reason is because when we see this method, stub address request, it's like, well, hang on, what exactly are we stubbing? We're stubbing this entry's endpoint URL. And maybe it's even better to do this. Oops. Okay. Maybe we can say this. Maybe that's clearer. Stub address request. And we're saying stub this URL with this certain response. And I don't really like stub address request. We'll maybe address that in a second. Let's first fix these. So we have URL and what do we call it? Just response. Response. Okay. URL. Response. Since I changed kind of a lot just now, I'm going to rerun my test. Okay, it still works. Okay, I'm going to commit that just because I am pretty happy with that, and I don't want to mess it up with whatever I do next. Okay, make request stubbing easier to understand. Okay. And I would call this method just stub request, but then it would conflict with this. So I'm really just calling it something different for the sake of not having a conflict, which I don't really like to have to do. Let's see if we can think of a better name. And by the way, I spend a lot of time on naming things. I think it's worth, think about the payroll cost of like 3 people getting together and just deciding the name of a class, for example. That might be quite expensive to do that, but I'm willing to like spend, let's say, $10,000 on a name. I'm willing to spend like $10,000 for a good name because a bad name might cost $100,000. And so it's worth it to spend a lot of time on a name. Like, I don't think it's crazy to spend an entire day just deciding what the name of a class is going to be. Because think about when you give something the wrong name, think about the cost. Like, first of all, there's the cost to correct it later if you want to. You have to change maybe a database table. You have to change all the places it appears in the code. That might be quite expensive and risky. It might even be so risky that you can't do it. And then think about the cost that's incurred every time you see one name, but you have to remember, oh yeah, this thing is called this, but it really means this other thing. That incurs a cost every time you see it. And so again, it's better to pay that small cost one time than pay a much larger cost over time later. Anyway, let's think about this particular name. Stub address request. WordPress response body. Stub WordPress request. Maybe that's better. Okay, and I'm going to run the test. Okay. Okay. So I like that better. Maybe it's not the most perfect thing still, but maybe we're at a point of diminishing returns. One thing that I often like to do is I'll refactor something up until the point where I'm no longer sure that I'm making an improvement. How is this different from what we started with? Yeah, that's a great question. I'll cover that in just a moment. What was I going to say? Oh yeah. Sometimes people worry about like wasting time refactoring, which is a valid concern. In the way that I ensure that I'm not refactoring too much, I'm not gold plating, that kind of thing, is I only refactor I only refactor when I'm sure that I'm making an improvement. If I start to make changes where I'm not sure it's an improvement, I'll stop. I might even revert something. And sometimes if you look at a piece of code too long, you're just too familiar with what's there. You can't put yourself in the shoes of somebody who's seeing it for the first time. Because the whole point of refactoring is to make things easier to understand and change. And one of the best times to refactor is when you're looking at a file fresh and you aren't very familiar with it. Either you've never seen it or you haven't seen it in a long time. And so you have to try to understand it. If you try to understand what you're seeing and you have a hard time understanding it, then you know for sure that if you make attempts to make it easier to understand, your efforts won't be a waste of time because you've just proved that the code is too hard to understand. So with this, I'm calling it stub WordPress request. I think that's pretty good. Maybe there's something that could be better, but I don't think I'm going to try to come up with something even better right now. I think I'll wait a period of time, and next time I look at this file fresh, I can then determine whether this name is fitting or not. And maybe I'll have a better idea at that point in time. Okay, so I'm going to commit this change that I just made. Okay, so we renamed stub address request to stub WordPress request. Okay, so Ori asked, how is this different from what we started with? That's a good question. So from a functional perspective, it's not different at all. It's the exact same. We're still exercising the same exact behavior. We're still making the same assertion. But my hope is that it's easier to understand. Let's pull up the old one and the new one side by side. Okay. So I'm going to say git checkout that commit recipient. Whoops, no, git checkout that commit recipient list spec. Okay. Now I'm going to copy that, call it old recipient list spec. Okay, and then I'll open the new one. Oh, sorry, I need to check out the current one. Okay, so here, oh, I shouldn't have done it this way. Oh, and it's the same exact thing. Okay, I did that wrong somehow. All right, hang on a second. Okay. What am I looking at? Okay, so what I'm seeing right now is the old version. Oops. Okay, let's look at that now. Okay, now we have the two different versions. Now I'm going to open here the old one. Now I'm going to open here the new one. I'm going to open here the old one. Okay. No, sorry. I'm going to do it the other way around. Okay. Now, when you look at these two files, I think the one on the right is a little bit easier to understand than the one on the left. So first of all, when I look at this, the first thing I'm going to look at, well, okay, first of all, when people read things, they read top to bottom. So the first thing I see is this entries endpoint URL. That means nothing to me. If I don't know anything about this program, I don't know what that's all about. It's this incidental detail, but it's the first thing I see. And that feels inappropriate. Maybe the second thing I look at is this. This is describing the whole test. And I see consuming recipients, but I don't know what that means. Like, what does it mean to consume a recipient? Like, consume how? We see this response body and it's like, okay, I can see what this is, but like, what's that all about? Like, why do we have this? Stub request. This is a fairly inscrutable piece of code. It's very noisy. It's a little bit hard to understand. And then includes the recipient. That's fine. But as a whole, this test is a bit hard to understand. Now, if we go to this newer one, we don't have this incidental detail of entries endpoint URL at the top here. The first thing we see is describe recipient list. So it's abundantly clear the overall thing we're testing. And then we see this first test case, consuming recipients from the WordPress API. And you know what? This can even be improved still. Consuming the names and addresses. You know what? Maybe, okay, maybe we should say consuming of form entries from the WordPress API. Yes. Yeah, that's a little bit better, I think. Okay. What's this test about? It's about consuming form entries from the WordPress API. That's something I can understand, I think, even if I don't know anything about this program. And even I'll say this, consuming recipient form entries. Consuming recipient form entries from the WordPress API. Okay. And we have this response body here, WordPress response body. So that makes it a little bit clearer that what this response body is the WordPress response body. So in connection with this, consuming recipient form entries from the WordPress API, WordPress response body. It's not too hard to make the connection. Oh, okay, we're doing something with the WordPress API, we're consuming entries from it. Here's the WordPress response body. And then here we're stubbing the WordPress request. We're saying for this URL, give this response. And since WordPress response body is so near, it's not too hard to make that connection. And there we're just instantiating a recipient list. And we're saying that it formats the response into a hash. And then if we want to, we can go down and see the details of how this request is stubbed, but we don't have to. Okay. So, Ori, that's how I'd answer how these two are different. Okay. Let's see if there's anything else we want to do. Oh no, I didn't mean to do that. I forgot that I made that small improvement. Okay. Consuming recipient form entries from the WordPress API. So we'll say improve test description. Okay. Now, let's take a look at this. Going back to the fact that I feel like there's kind of a mismatch between the fact that this is the recipient list and we're doing this low level detail of formatting the response into a hash. So we're exercising recipient list.items here. So let's see what this items method does. Offset is 0. Who knows what that means? Recipients is an empty array. Okay, I can understand that. Print downloading recipients. Okay. And then in a loop, we get the response. We get the total count. We're adding an item to the recipients array. We're mapping these keys 1 and 2 to the keys of name and address, because that's the way the WordPress form gives them back. 1's mapped to name and 2 is mapped to address. And I happen to actually know that this offset is because the WordPress API results are paginated. Break if offset. Oh yeah, okay. So okay. So the WordPress API gives us the total recipient count, or the total page count rather. And so we're saying break if the current page or whatever is greater than the total count. So maybe we can make this a bit easier to understand. And maybe this needs more tests because I want to refactor this, but I don't want to refactor it without having tests to make sure that I'm not introducing regressions. Okay. So let me think for a second. I feel like offset should really be called page index or something like that. And that feels like quite a safe change. So I'm actually going to do that. I feel okay about doing that particular change without adding any tests. Okay, and total count, we can call that total page count. Okay, so let's see. And you know what? Sometimes something I do when I'm refactoring is I just refactor freely without worrying about preserving the existing behavior. And then I revert everything because I'm just refactoring experimentally. Okay, so what if I like get a certain page? What if I have a method that represents getting a certain page? Okay. No, I don't like that. Okay, let's see. Page index. Okay, because here's the issue. Right now, we're like mixing the detail of dealing with the pagination with the formatting of the address. It feels inappropriate to mix those two things, or rather, it makes it harder to understand to mix those two things than to have those two things separate. So I'm trying to figure out how to separate those two things, although it's not all that easy. Let's see. Maybe we can have a method that gets us the current page. So what if we do something like this? Okay, page index. So we have the total count. No, don't like that either. Okay. Let's do something totally crazy. Okay, let's take this out. And even for a second, I'm going to take out this print because it's distracting me. And what if I say something like this? Um, well, pages. No. Okay, let's see. I'm even gonna get rid of this. Okay, maybe I'll say, oh, I know. I'll say break unless any more pages. I feel like that's easy to understand. All right. So now that I've like figured out that that's how I want to express the code, I'm going to say break unless any more pages. Okay. And then I can have a method called any more pages. But you know what? I'm getting ahead of myself. Because I don't have automated tests that cover this exact part, I have to rely on manual testing. So let me manually test this. I'll have to figure out how to do that. Okay. So what I'm doing now is I'm running my program without any changes to make sure that it works before my changes. And good thing I did because it doesn't work. So let's look at that. When I created this recipient list class, I broke my existing program. So I'm going to fix that. Recipient list equals recipient list.new. Recipient list dot items. Okay, we'll see if that makes it work. Okay, uninitialized constant recipient list. That makes sense because we're not including it. Okay, still doesn't work. So let's see why that is. Okay, this error is on line 57 of recipient list. So you guys are also getting a little chance to see how I go about solving these little errors. Okay, so undefined method map for nil class means response JSON entries is nil. And I have no idea why that's the case. And so what I see now is that I made a mistake. I made too many changes without manually testing my whole program. So rather than try to figure out what the problem is, I'm just going to go back to a point in time when this program worked. Okay, that is fascinating. I went back to June 7th when I believed that this program last worked, but it still doesn't work. So maybe my changes break it, maybe they don't. But this is not working. So let's see if we can figure out why. So we've completely changed topics here. We've gone from adding tests to now we're debugging. Let's see if we can figure this out. So let's state what's happening here. So I have my WordPress API that I can hit and get my recipients, but this line isn't working. So I'm gonna try to nail down where the problem is, because it's easier to figure out where a problem is than what a problem is. So my first question is my WordPress API even working at all? So I'm going to do this. I'm going to do curl. Let's see if I have it in my history here. Okay. I do have a curl request, and I don't want to do this in my main monitor because this has people's addresses. I'm going to have to rotate my keys after this too. But over in my other monitor, I'm going to run this curl request and see what happens. Okay. My key might be bad because I get an error that says forbidden. So bear with me a second. I'm going to see if I can grab my correct keys. And we'll go for just a few more minutes here, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay, so I'm going to see if I can see where my keys are. Okay, so I can see that I'm not even doing this the right way. Let's try this a different way. So I'm going to look at the place in recipient list where it first makes the request. So here we have the certain URI, which you might recognize from the test. And here's where it makes the request. So I'll do this. I'll first just paste the response code. So I'll say puts response code response dot code. Okay. So let's see what that is. Ah, interesting. Response code is 401. I think that means unauthorized. Unauthorized. Yeah, so I may have a problem with my keys. So we'll have to leave it there. We can't proceed like this because that part is broken. But we've at least narrowed down the problem. The problem is not necessarily anything to do with the code. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But in any case, I'm not authenticating to my API correctly. And so I need to fix that before I can do anything else. But I don't want to fix that on video. I'll fix that off camera, and then we can continue after that. Okay. So thus concludes my live coding portion. Let's now have a little bit of discussion if you guys want to. First of all, just any questions or comments or anything right now.
Yeah. So this is from what you said a bit of a while ago, which was that when you look at a file uh, for the first time in a while, or if you've never seen it before, then that's the best time to refactor it. And I get this feeling a lot that you know, that I agree with that. But when I look at a file for the first time and I don't understand it, the first thing I think is that I'm not clever enough to understand what's going on,
Mm.
rather than the code is written in a way that needs refactoring.
Oh,
So I guess how do you know that, how do I know when I look at a file that that it needs to be refactored?
that's a good question. I've said before that we don't write good code because we're smart. We write good code because we're stupid. Um, and maybe I even said it like this. I don't write good code because I'm smart. I write good code because I'm stupid. And what I mean is that I want to write for an audience of somebody who well, I don't want the reader of my code to have to exert a lot of mental effort in order to understand my code. And so that's why I think it's worthwhile to take the effort to make it easily understandable. And I don't think it should require a genius to understand my code. Um, and so when you look at a piece of code and you say you think maybe it's because you're not clever enough to understand that piece of code, I think the fault lies with the writer of that code, not with the reader of the code. Because I think a good piece of code is understandable even by somebody who's not that smart. And I'm not saying that about you, of course. Um, but the reason I say that is just to prove that like the problem is not with you if you can't understand a piece of code. The problem is that the other person didn't make it easy enough to understand.
Makes sense. Yeah, I like that phrase. I don't write good code because I'm smart. I write it because I'm stupid. Ah, that's good.
Yeah, exactly.
I had another question, which was, I mean, this kind of process of writing clients that request from various APIs feels like a big portion of the work that, at least that I'm doing right now. I'm not sure if it's
Okay.
a big thing in general. So, how would you go about doing this in a production environment? Uh, I mean, you've got errors like the 401 unauthorized, or if it's, I don't know, timing out. There's so much to think about. Um, so how do you go about doing that?
Yeah. Well, that's a pretty big question. There's a lot that I could address. One thing that comes to mind right now is there's kind of a flaw in my program. I had a test for the success case, but I didn't have a test for the failure case. And because I didn't have a test for the failure case, I don't have any code in my application code that accounts for the failure case. And so when we saw that 401, when we got that 401 from the WordPress API, we just got kind of a raw, mysterious error, undefined method map for nil class. What would have been better is if my program just said unauthorized rather than that mysterious error. So that's one thing that's coming to mind. But that's kind of a detail. That's just something I was put in mind of by the stuff we went over today. But maybe I can ask you, like, is there anything more specific that you're curious about when you ask, like, how do you handle this in a production environment?
Yeah, I read recently this article about gateways, and it, I kind of got into a rabbit hole of reading about all these enterprise patterns of, their connections and facades, and I even got this textbook on them. So um I was wondering what your approach is in that kind of uh area. I mean, do you use gateways for something like this to separate out the concerns? We were talking about the low level and the kind of more abstract bits of the code. Yeah, I guess this is a big question.
Yeah, and some of that's even over my head. Like, I'm not familiar with the concept of a gateway, or if I am, I know it by a different name. What I do sometimes that might be related is, like, I don't know the quality of the APIs that you're working with, but quite often these third-party APIs are very low quality and they return inconsistent results. The formatting is inconsistent, names are inconsistent, that kind of thing. And so I'll often write a piece of code that interfaces with that API, which smooths out all the rough edges so that the thing I'm dealing with in my program can all just be at a high level of abstraction, and I don't have to bring those nasty details into my program of smoothing out those rough edges. So if that overlaps with the kind of stuff you're talking about, then yes. But again, some of that stuff is over my head.
Makes sense. So then how do you test that bit of code? And
Yeah,
yeah,
good
that is the
question.
same as a gateway, I think.
Oh, okay. Similarly to how I'm doing in my program, where I had a hard coded value that was representative of the kind of response I would get from the API. And then I tested the transformations on that hard coded value. Like in my example, it's a pretty simple transformation in my program. I'm taking what it said was the key for one, and I mapped one to name, and I mapped two to address, and so I tested that. Um, and sometimes there's the question of how you get that value, also that hard coded value. There are libraries that can capture those values for you automatically. You can do something as simple as hit the production API once and then copy and paste it into your program. But however you do it, the point is that I'll hard code something so that I'm dealing with my own hard coded values rather than hitting the real API.
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Li Ping, any questions from you?
I think it's a very good live debugging course for me. I haven't touched the retesting pretty much, but I believe in the future we will do those kind of part. Probably from my side, I can understand it just like, for example, you take a block of code to a separate method. You make the code maybe have high, clear logic, and it's easy for you say for other people. Actually, it's kind of maintained because our system right now is running for 16 years. Actually, it's
Mm.
good for other developer to read, maintain, or fix bug honestly, from my side, my understanding is that, yeah.
Yeah, great. Yeah, even those small, seemingly inconsequential changes, like changing a variable name or moving something into a new method, can go a long way toward making something easier to understand. Okay, well, thanks, Liping and Ori, for joining me this morning. I hope you found today's session helpful. Liping, stick around after I hit the
Sure.
stop button on the recording, and you and I can talk. And Ori, thanks again for coming, and I'll see you next time. And dear viewers on the internet, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay. Oh, I actually don't know how to. I don't know how to stop it. So I'm going to stop it and then get right back on.
Okay, sure.